Well, welcome and kia ora to the webinar. My name is Trevor Vass. I'm one of the founders of the ATC. I'd like to begin today by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land where I live in Blair-Gowrie, the Boon Wurrung Aboriginal people, and pay my respects to elders, past, present and emerging, and I extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders people. Could I get you all, all the attendees, would you mind just sort of using the chat, let us know where you're calling in from, we'd love to know where you are. Eric, where are you?
Hello, yes, I am in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, in the United States.
And Eric is the EVP of Innovation at Modern Hire. Craig, thank you. You can see there, we've got people from Perth, Melbourne. A few kia oras there. Wonderful. Okay, I'd like to introduce our panelists. Claire. Claire's the Senior Talent Acquisition Manager at Westpac, New Zealand. Eric Sydell is the EVP of Innovation at Modern Hire. And Grant Meyer, who is the Managing Director, APAC of Modern Hire. So welcome everyone and welcome to the webinar. Today we're discussing bias in hiring. And Eric, I'd like to start with you. Why are we having this discussion now? Why is it important?
Yeah, thanks, Trevor. Well, bias is a huge topic, and it's especially huge these days. It seems like it's getting a lot of press, a lot of coverage, but I think there are some reasons for that. And in my view, bias is one of the key problems of our time. And I'm not just talking about hiring, but I mean in general. I think it's one of the biggest problems that we have to solve as humans. And the reason for that is because of AI. AI, artificial intelligence, has really come on the scene in force in just the last few years. And AI is really good at finding and uncovering bias. And also, if you're not careful, of scaling bias. So if AI algorithms are trained on data that has bias in it, then if the developers aren't careful, that bias can be scaled up to impact an entire population. And I think that happens a lot. And in fact, it's the normal state of things right now, because I don't think the world realized how biased data was until a few years ago. So, what I do is I study bias and I study AI for Modern Hire. And so I'm pretty deeply enmeshed in thinking about these issues. And AI is something that can cause bias if it's developed incorrectly, but it can also fix bias. It's basically just a way that we can detect bias in large samples of data. So to me, that's the big opportunity right now, is AI is transforming our world and uncovering all this type of bias that we didn't really realize existed. And now we have to find it, and we have to figure out how to get rid of it from these algorithms.
Claire, from your perspective, and Westpac in particular, why was bias important?
I think for us, we want to reflect our communities and the people that we serve. And I think that's something that Westpac sort of stands by. And, we're an organisation that is very transparent. You'll have seen it. We've put out there our gender pay gap's been published. Our women in leadership stats are published on an annual basis. And so for us to be able to, as I said, best serve our customers and communities, we need to have a reflective workforce. And so we need to make sure that our recruitment process and the processes that we have within Westpac aren't holding any bias.
Claire, is it just the recruitment process or also the sourcing process? How do you because I'm quite aware that the sourcing process leads into the recruitment side of things.
Yeah, no, it is the sourcing process as well. And I think for us, it was being very aware of, and an example I can give you is where we've got, we hire a lot of banking, what we now call banking specialists. Now, typically, we would have put them under a customer service category in the past. If you look at the sheer volume of people that are signed up to receive notifications under customer service, predominantly they are female. So it's actually thinking about what you're using to source, the channels that you're using to source, or the categories that you're using to source, the mediums you're using to source candidates, to really start to unpick that bias.
Really fascinating. Grant, from your perspective, what's the state of bias in Australia and New Zealand?
Yeah, it's interesting. And just listening to both Clare and Eric's comments there, for me, it's quite we're at an interesting time in that bias is not something new. And if you come from the backgrounds that perhaps Eric and I come from, this has been front and center in terms of a lot of what we do. So if you come from developing tools that are going to help talent acquisition professionals, tests, assessments, interviews, they need to be fair. So this is not necessarily a new topic. However, it's getting so much attention at the moment. And I think, there's been worldwide events where bias has been at the forefront, and lots of questions have been asked, which then leads into discrimination and prejudices, et cetera, et cetera. So I think it's become a hot topic. And then obviously that then gets related back to the talent acquisition process, where what is part of the job that we're doing? We are trying to differentiate between candidates. We're trying to find those better candidates. So there's a decision-making process involved, which involves some kind of discriminating between candidates. But the trick there is it's got to be job relevant, it's got to be fair, etc. So I think it's an absolutely a timely topic to be getting so much focus at the moment. And when I think about the current status, I sort of start thinking about the awareness is absolutely heightened at the moment, and there's a lot of focus on it. I think the practical solutions, that's still a work in progress to me. So, you jump onto LinkedIn or any of those kind of platforms, there's so much conversation, there's so much, there's even research going into it. However, I think there's this lag effect with regard to, so what do we do? And what I'm certainly seeing is, despite the heightened awareness, we're still seeing some simplistic solutions being put in place. And, so what's the easy thing to do? Let's throw a quota in there, just because we can measure it and we can be seen to be doing something and we feel good about doing the right things. But then what Eric was just touching on there is that, there's some technology enabled solutions which we're starting to see. And there's some claims being made about these technology solutions, which to me are really interesting. However, it can go both ways. So if, for example, there's bias incorporated into one of those technology enabled solutions, well, then you just put bias on steroids, right? Because it's such a powerful technology intervention, which can actually exacerbate potential bias if not designed correctly and implemented correctly. While at the same time, if done properly, it can be seen as a solution because you're aiding that human judgment element, or you're trying to. I don't believe eliminating bias is possible even, but reducing it and minimizing bias, or at least becoming aware of it and then being able to work around that.
What really resonated with me was aiding that human judgment process to reduce bias. Interestingly, telling Lucy earlier today that when the ATC was created, Kevin and I, our key objective, mission, if you will, was to improve recruitment outcomes consistently in Australia and New Zealand, and certainly, what you're talking about does that. Eric, just a question to you that, as I was listening to both of you, can you just distinguish or differentiate the difference between unconscious and conscious bias?
Sure, yeah. So, the way I look at bias, and I'm a psychologist, is that we're all biased, right? We are bias machines, effectively. Our brains take in a ton of information constantly and have various different cognitive mechanisms that help us make sense of that information. A lot of those lead us to biased conclusions of one form or another. So our brains are wired for bias. They're wired to make very quick snap decisions with incomplete sets of information based on prior experiences and things of that nature. So there's a whole component of unconscious, aspect that's there. Then, conscious is obviously sort of the thing that people do when they deliberately, make a biased decision. And I think that we would consider that more to be, things like racism are conscious outcomes of that sort of bias.
Fantastic. And that leads nicely into, so Claire, why did Westpac undergo this? What were the issues in bias that you encountered before you, started this process? Can you sort of tell us a little bit about what you were trying to achieve and how you've gone about it?
Sorry, I just lost you slightly there. Could you just go back over that again?
Yeah,
Sorry.
Absolutely. So what were the issues you saw occurring at Westpac, Claire, in terms of bias? What were the key things and how did you go about identifying those?
Yeah, so initially it was, there was a lot of gut feel, to be honest. And I think as internal recruiters or recruiters, you'll often think there's something not quite right here. And you started to see it in the data that came through. And I think it's really important to be able to capture some of your data and really start to analyze it. And it was when we started to capture a lot of the pieces around not only gender, but some of the the diversity stats around ethnicity or the neurodiversity stats, those sorts of things, you would start to see pockets that would come through where actually you were getting more females or a certain age group or more males. And so it became really important to go, well, what's creating this? What's causing it? And actually just try and start to put a roadmap in place that we could continue. I think the big thing is recognizing that there's an issue. And some of it was as simple as going, actually, what we are seeing is hiring managers who, if you have two females interviewing, the outcomes seem to be that they were more likely to hire a female. Wow. If you had two males interviewing, the outcomes seemed to be more likely that they would hire a male. And it was an unconscious thing. People didn't seem to, it wasn't until you sort of gave them some of the stats that they would start to go, okay. So as we started to present that data to senior leaders within the organisation, it's hard to ignore. And actually, what can we do in the process to be able to enable that? So it's a journey that we're on. Our system was a big piece that didn't enable people with disabilities easily to be able to apply for roles. And so just being able to really unpick the whole process and see where the biases are has been significant. And are we there? Absolutely not. I think it'll be something that we continue to refine on an ongoing basis as we go through.
I'd love to hear from the audience in terms of any biases that you've got there. You've got a Q&A box there that you could type a question in or a comment in. We'd love to be able to see what you've got there as well. We talked about tech. We've got a question here. Great discussion. How would you just differentiate, structural and group differences versus bias? For example, there are clear differences in personality traits and language used between males and females, and then bias versus adverse impact. Gosh, it's quite a long question. Thank you for that. Eric, can you have a stab at this and tell us what you think?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think that there are certainly a lot of differences between different groups of people, and that is always the case. When we look at bias, we're looking at it in the sense of predicting job performance. So we're trying to make decisions about who to hire, who's going to perform the best, And when we do that, we don't want there to be group differences, and with one group, any particular group scoring, routinely higher or lower than another group. And the reason is that, overall, we want the workforce to be diverse, and we want it to be representative of the population. So, that's sort of how we approach it. And it's not answering your question, because yes, there are differences, between different groups and different peoples. And I guess we in what we do don't so much concern ourselves with, average levels of a certain trait. We're really trying to help our clients hire a diverse workforce and one that performs as well as possible. And so we balance those two things, predictive validity of predicting job performance and bias to ensure things are fair. And I think that, the topic of bias goes beyond just hiring. It's something that is societally important, that we, allow people from all classes a fair chance, at getting that job. So it's more than, just what our clients necessarily want, but it's a societal kind of zeitgeist that we're in right now, at least in the United States, and I think globally to a large extent as well.
Great question, and thank you. If there's any others, please put them there. We're getting quite a few through, and I think we might tackle some of these. And I think, Grant, we're about to sort of tackle that, because there's one here from Clare. Thank you, Clare. From Sadie, forgive me, that you touched on systems. I'd love to understand a little more about what Westpac has identified as systems of bias, what changed in these systems to help the new one. So, Grant, would you like to sort of talk a little bit about the systems? And Claire, you could also add your bit to it as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Trevor. And I think sort of building on a little bit from what Eric introduced there as well, is that, when we look at it from a high perspective, we look at bringing three things together to be able to not only predict performance, but also reduce bias and meet other objectives which talent acquisition professionals are struggling with. And I think what we see is a lot of focus in the market is we latch onto one solution, and that's going to fix all of the problems. And it's really about a combination of different things that we can do. And where we like to focus is on, first of all, the science is absolutely critical. And I think going to the initial question about adverse impact and just making sure that we're measuring job relevant characteristics, we're giving every candidate an opportunity to demonstrate their capability. I think those are two of the fundamentals from a fairness perspective. So making sure the science is right, and then supplementing that with the technology. So what we see a lot in the market is some very clever technology-based solutions, which can solve a lot of the problems that we're having just within the broader talent acquisition process. And part of that is using the technology to solve for some of these bias issues. But I think it's a bringing together of those two things. So it needs to be science-based solutions, which are demonstrating that there's no adverse impact, demonstrating that we're able to differentiate between candidates based on potential performance on the role, and then utilizing the technology to be able to turn that into a practical solution. So it's bringing those two things together. I think we see some very strong, rigorous tools out there which potentially are just not candidate friendly, so it fails the candidate experience test. But equally, we've got some very clever technology which maybe it doesn't measure up to the science requirements. And then the last piece to that puzzle would be the journey is ongoing. And I think Claire talked about that a little bit as well, is to say we put a solution in today, we've got to continuously measure that, both from a bias perspective, but also how well is the tool actually working in terms of predicting on the job performance. So we like to think about, at least on an annual basis, is to continually validate the tools that we've implemented to check for things like adverse impact, but also to check how are the tools working? Are they actually predicting that performance? And can we pick up any biases through the statistical analyses that we deploy through that process?
Grant, could you simply and briefly, what is adverse impact? Because there was we got that as a question before. I mean, what does it mean?
So basically, it's let's say you put in a tool or a process, and is that discriminating unfairly against a particular group of individuals. So, the obvious one, does it discriminate unfairly against females as opposed to males, or perhaps a cultural group?
Right.
Yeah. So just because of the very fact that I fall into a group, and very often it's a minority group, am I potentially going to be discriminated against unfairly because of the tool that we're using?
Got it. No, thank you. Claire, I mean, just to answer Sadie's question, what technology did you put in at Westpac?
So we're in the midst of doing that at the moment. And so we're in a very fortunate position that we are in a new rollout of a new recruitment management system, and we're moving to Workday. But the thing for us was that the system we were currently using, or that we're currently using, because of, I mean, it's technology that is a number of years old, and it's not easy for people for us, like if I look at the system, it's not easy for people with disabilities to really to utilize with be it, there's a software called JAWS, which is for people with visual impairments, and it's not as friendly, so it does make it really challenging for those people. So just keeping those things in mind when you're then putting in a new system, and be that as your recruitment management system or as a system as part of your recruitment process, I think has been key for us to really understand and be very mindful of as we go through this.
Thank you. Got a question here from James Turkland. Thank you, James. I'm very aware of the nature of, from a gender and cultural perspective. However, ageism is a real issue. Do you have any case studies? One for my own heart there, in terms of that. Eric, is there any case studies on ageism that you know
of? I don't know if I have a specific case study on ageism. I mean, I think that, what we do is we look at all the different classes of protected individuals, race, color, religion, sex, national origin in the United States, and age is, part of that. So we certainly recommend monitoring, selection scores and things like that for bias on age.
Fantastic. And a great question here from Rachel. How in the context of Westpac have you tried so far to influence hiring managers to get them to change their behaviours? Really good question. Once the data is flagged, what are the actions you've implemented more broadly? Claire, can you sort of give us some sort of notion of how you've changed behaviour of the hiring managers?
Yeah, and I think it is absolutely educating. Calling it out is the big thing, is really making them aware of what the, really making them aware of what the data is telling them. And certainly in the last few years, when I've run sessions with them, they're actually quite surprised, because they will tell you that they don't have a bias. They've all of our hiring managers and people go through unconscious bias training and all of those sorts of things. So, but there is a real they actually just want to get a person in the door, and the right person in the door, and they don't think about, when you start to bring out the data around the number of what their team looks like, or broader data that's not just recruitment on the individual candidate, but the makeup of teams, and you start to actually have that discussion with them. It's not until then they actually start to go, oh. But also, most of our hiring managers, if not all of them, will have it flagged as a diversity is a key performance indicator for them, that it is something they are very aware of. It is something, as I said, Westpac are very transparent. It is very visible on all people leader dashboards. And so keeping it front of mind, it's not something that they do once and it's a course that they sit on and then and then they don't visit it again, but really starting to challenge them with, be it with the data, or you know, and it being front of mind.
Fantastic. We know we've talked a bit about technology, and I wouldn't mind sort of deep diving a little bit further with Eric and Grant in terms of that. What are some of the existing solutions that certainly Modern Hire have and in the market at the moment? Eric, could I start with you, please?
Sure. Yeah. Thank you. Let me, if I can, do you mind if I show a slide or two here?
No, I'd love you to show a slide.
Yeah, so let me just pull up one slide here. In particular, find the right deck. Here we go. You know, Modern Hire has two main solutions. One is an assessment called the Virtual Job Tryout, and it's sort of a day in the life simulation of what it's like to do a job, where we collect a ton of data and then use that to predict the likelihood of success in a role. At the same time, we're monitoring those results for biases and over time taking them out of the scoring to make sure that the scoring is as fair as possible. And the other big thing is interviews on demand and live interviews and things of that nature. But this slide is a slide that shows some of the results when using that virtual job tryout across 5 different industries. And this is over a number of years and a number of clients. But these systems are all designed to predict performance. And so we have data that shows the higher you score, the better your performance as a store manager, as a healthcare associate, et cetera. But what you can see here is that before these systems were implemented versus after, there's a sizable percentage change in diversity levels, where the white percentage goes down and the others go up almost across the board for those protected classes. And again, this is without sacrificing the prediction of performance, and that's the key thing. So I think that what's so interesting, and I've been studying this type of data for 20 years, people are biased. We're all biased, you know, unconsciously, hopefully, some consciously as well. But we all have a tendency to select people that are similar to ourselves. And so that type of unconscious bias tends to lead to, you know, workforces that aren't as diverse as the population around them is. And so solutions like this, what they do is they make it objective. They make it objective what characteristics are related to performance, and they weed out all the things that aren't related to performance and that are subjective, that our unconscious minds might value. Maybe a person has tattoos, or we think they're somehow funny looking or not tall enough, or, you know, their skin color or their age, etc. And so those things all go out the door, and you only look at a narrower subset of competencies that are actually job relevant. And this is what happens. This is what happens over time when you do that.
Fantastic. I've got a great question here, which sort of follows on from something you were saying, Claire, about you mentioned hiring managers were going through some training, and the specific question from Paul at Kilby saying, what courses have you had your hiring managers go through to help with interviewing, coaching them to ask the right questions, especially around bias? Claire, could you let us know what you're doing?
Yeah, so we've, I mean, we're very fortunate being the size of the organisation that we are. So we've obviously got psychologists on site at Westpac Group. They help with the interview questions. We have an interview library. We're doing more specific interview training for our own hiring managers at Westpac New Zealand, because we've got our own, you know, nuances, I guess, and challenges that we face. So a lot of ours is based on feedback from hiring managers, but it is through feedback that we've had from hiring managers. But because there are, I guess that was one of the challenges we faced around. And I think a lot of people, and this probably, you know, where that some of this question has come from, people like to have a chat, and they will hear what they want to hear potentially, and just really getting hiring managers to understand listening. We provide an interview guide for them with questions and probing questions at the back. so that they don't actually have to try and think on their feet, if you like. They've got questions that relate to certain behaviours that we're looking for in the organisation. So it is pretty prescriptive for them. Trying to align them with, with the recruitment processes you go through, making sure that they go through and they understand that the questions they are asking are aligned to the job description, the requirements that they need for the job. But there is a lot of hand holding that's gone into our interview guides, but with great feedback.
Sort of brings us nicely to my next question, which is, what is ethical hiring? What does it look like in the recruitment process? Grant, would you like to have a stab at that, please?
Yeah, absolutely. So when I think about the first thought that comes to mind when I'm asked a question about ethical hiring is, my default is I'll go to the candidate. And everybody on this webinar has probably been a candidate at some point in time. And so for me, the absolute minimum criteria around, are we being fair to that candidate in terms of giving that candidate a fair opportunity to demonstrate their capability to do the job. So for me, that's the starting point. Obviously related to that is then, do we have the tools which have been designed in a way that ensures the consistent and fair treatment of those candidates? Are they refined over time? Who in fact designed those tools as well? And that's an interesting area that is becoming quite a hot topic at the moment. So we've always talked about, okay, so are the tools that we're using, are they fair to candidates? I think we're starting, as a provider in this space, we're starting to be asked questions around, what was the team makeup from a diversity perspective in terms of maybe who built the algorithms or who built the tools, who tested the tools, etc. Because could there be some inherent biases built into that process as well? So it's about how the tools are constructed, but it comes back to that candidate and that consistent treatment of the candidate. Something else that with the advent of technology as well is undisclosed information, or does the candidate know what they've been evaluated on? And for me, that's a massive ethical issue that I think we're still grappling with in this space. Is that, once again, to that point around technology can do clever things in terms of internet scraping, social media scraping, etc. And we're saying, well, first of all, is that information is it job relevant? Is it going to predict on the job performance? But perhaps more importantly is, does the candidate know you're looking at that information? And I think there's a very significant ethical question that all of us in the TA space as TA experts have to kind of think about. If a candidate applies for the role, if they submit a resume, if they complete an assessment, if they participate in an interview, all of that, the candidate knows that they're providing that information, and they know that it's probably going to be evaluated as part of the decision-making process. But through the advent of AI, there's a lot of other stuff that is able to be done. And we refer to the glass or black box approach to AI. And we say, well, looking at Facebook profiles, for an example, is that job relevant? Is that ethical? And should that be looked at? And is that a predictor of on-the-job performance? So it's about placing the candidate at the heart of everything that you do, and make your judgments based on that, on the candidate. Is it intentional information that the candidate has provided to you? And then how are those tools not only designed, but deployed and continuously upgraded? I think those are three key areas to focus on from an ethical use of ethics within talent acquisition. And
thank you, Grant. Got a great question here from Mark. Would you consider cultural fit a gateway or a precursor of bias? And I've got sort of a question that hangs on that too, which is about referral schemes. But Eric, would you or Claire, would you like to sort of give me your take on cultural fit as a precursor of bias?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's got to be the right, and we've had experience, I guess, in this space, and it's got to be the right cultural fit assessment, I think. And the big thing is that it's part of the process. It's not, you don't use it as a screening out tool, or you don't use it as a it should just form another data point, if you like, in the process. And I think often we do see that there's too much emphasis put on, especially if they're done up front, a cultural fit assessment or something similar. And my thoughts are that it needs to be part of the process, and it needs to be a validated tool. It needs to, but it is also one of these things that needs to be visited regular, dependent on the data that's coming out of it, because you'll find that each business units will have personas and all of those sorts of things. It needs to be something that is continually validated every 6 months. Is what is the data telling us? I would say it's a gateway to being part of an organisation and understanding an organisation's culture, and whether you want to be part of that or not. But it shouldn't be used as a screening out tool.
No, really good point. Eric and I were talking earlier about referral schemes, and the question I put to Eric was the paradox of, by very nature, I tend to sort of accumulate people who are similar to me in my network. And if I'm using a referral scheme, am I perpetuating bias? And Eric, what was your response on that? It was a really good one.
Well, I don't remember more than 4 seconds ago what happened, but I think that, my response to that is that we all do tend to look to sort of match up with people that are similar to us. And that can be similar to us in skin color or, any other factor, or just, how a person thinks and how they talk. Do they laugh at our jokes and so forth? All these types of tendencies make us, tend to prefer people similar to us. So I think that's the issue. And yeah, there certainly can be bias in a referral scheme or any other type of hiring process. And to me, I think what's really important is that we're collecting data and monitoring how these processes and tools are working, because something that even doesn't have bias today could have bias next week, as the demographics of the workforce changes and things. And so I think, for me, the big thing is we just need to make sure we're monitoring and searching, always searching for those that evidence of bias.
Got a great question here from Steve Scannell. Thank you, Steve. How do you ask candidates about diversity in a respectful and inclusive way in order to report on this information? Claire, have you got some thoughts on that, please?
God, that is a good question.
Very good question.
Yeah. I mean, we have it in our process currently that it is they can answer it, or it's absolutely optional as it is required to be in New Zealand, and we don't get to see that data until the person is hired. So even the people that aren't hired, we don't sort of it's challenging to get that information. But yeah, I think for us, and I know that this has come up as we go into the redesign of our systems and processes, is we've got our diversity and inclusion people involved. There's workshops I know that are being run just about how to ask the questions. How does someone who of a certain ethnicity or want to be asked the questions, or of a certain demographic want to be asked the questions? And that's probably doesn't answer your question, but it is certainly a challenging space. Sure. There's lots of opinions on it.
Grant, have you got any thoughts in terms of the clients that you're working with in terms of how they're dealing with this?
Yeah, absolutely, and it's a good question, but exactly a tough question as well. And I think we tend to look at it from our perspective is that you've got multiple steps in your process, and you can measure different things at different steps in that process. So I take the point. Tough interview question to ask is around diversity and cultural sensitivity, although there probably are ways to refine some of those. However, an area where we focused a lot on, especially in the absolute height of the pandemic, was, work requirements were changing, and work from home became a big issue. Digital readiness became a really big issue, and diversity and inclusion became a big issue at that time as well. So what we did was we designed some components to measure those key characteristics, which could get deployed at different parts of a process. So perhaps easier to deploy some of those, especially D&I related or culturally sensitive kind of measures, probably easier to deploy in an assessment, which we call virtual job tryouts, and get the candidate to respond to different situations in that environment, instead of asking what could be a very awkward interview question, which focuses on those topics as well.
Yeah, good answer. We're getting sort of to the wrap-up stage, and I'd really like to sort of, what are the key steps, just to summarise, and some of the things that we've said, that we take to reduce bias? And perhaps I'll go around each of the panelists and start with you, Claire. What are the things, if you were sort of offering some advice, what are the things that you would do to reduce bias?
I would say recognise where there's an issue. I think that's one of the big, there's no shame in saying, hey, look, actually, I believe that there's an issue or in this process. Recognise it, keep refining it, keep looking at the data. I think the data is the big one. The more access you've got to it, for me, it's been, in my experience, it's been beneficial to get people over the line on making decisions, but start to utilize tools that tie people back to the skills and experience of the job, and but really think through your processes. Yeah.
How often do you look at the data, and who do you share it with, Claire?
I mean, I look at it, I get a report on a weekly basis. I probably deep dive into it once a quarter to go, actually, that sort of gives me enough data, just because of the size of Westpac. It gives me enough data to go, actually, are they still working for us? What are we seeing in certain business units? Are we, and a lot of ours is reported on a quarterly basis up to the board. So,
Wow.
So we need to make, I need to be over it.
No, totally. Eric, in terms of what is it that you would encourage organisations to do?
Well, we study data, and we have different tools that we deploy to help make better quality hires with less bias. And I showed you that example of the slide earlier, which is results from the virtual job tryout assessment. We can do the same thing with interviews, where we score them with AI, and the scores that the AI generates are almost 4 times lower in potential for bias than human raters scores of those same responses. So there's tools like that can really help help us be more objective in the hiring process. But the other thing I want to mention is a new tool that we've been sort of researching really for a long time, that is on the sort of the high end of the funnel, where people interested in jobs can take an interest inventory, and that can help slot them, recommend different positions for them. And the thing that's super, super interesting about this tool is that what we found is that it recommends jobs to people who normally wouldn't consider that type of role, because they think it's for men or women or a certain class of individual that they're not. And a big example is field service technicians. These are people that service machines and things out in the wild for their companies, typically a male-dominated job. And yet, when we use this interest inventory, it recommends almost an even split of male and female for that job, because interest-wise, male and female are both aligned equally with that job, but females don't think of it that often. So that's a very interesting thing too, that I think companies can also do sort of higher in the funnel, is help candidates understand the positions you have and what they might be a fit for. And that can actually help dramatically increase the diversity of the applicant pool.
Eric, do you know of organisations, or could you share organisations that are doing that? Because I think that's there's a comment or a question in there about builders, and how would you sort of hire more women and things like that, and it seems to answer that question. Do you have practical examples?
Well, yes, we have. So that tool I mentioned, it's been in development with us for a while, really almost a decade we've been working on this, to be honest, which is far too long to be working on it. But it's recently been deployed with a large cable company in the United States, and they're the ones that we have the lion's share of data for, and they actually just won an award for this. So I'm not sure if potentially Grant could follow up and we could share that information with your audience, but there's more information available about it.
Oh, I think that'd be very useful, practical information in terms of that particularly. I mean, Australia's got a lot of sort of, building, construction, mining, and, those type of tools and examples would be very, very relevant for that sector. So, sorry, I've just lost my place. Grant, what about yourself in terms of what recommendations would you offer the audience?
Yeah, I think the responses from both Clare and Eric are absolutely spot on. And I think, we're in a state of heightened awareness. It's now about getting the data, and which Clare spoke about, and then absolutely using that. So bringing things to the surface and making enhancements, adjustments to keep on making sure that we're predicting performance at the same time minimizing bias, I think is absolutely critical. I think, for me, it's also a shift away from doing what we've always done, and this move away from dare I call it, a one-size-fits-all. So, we talk about the TA process, and then we talk about the tools that can complement those processes. And I think just moving away from, hey, we've always done it this way, this is a tool that maybe makes us look good, so we're going to implement those because it must be right, because we like what we read in terms of the outputs of the tool that's being used. And I think no individual process or tool is going to be right for every set of circumstances. And I think by using the same mold, we tend to potentially exacerbate biases because of those tools are not fit for purpose, etc. So I think there's a lot to be done in that space around looking at specific tools and processes for every unique set of circumstances as far as possible. And I think that enhances candidate fairness, probably going to grow candidate pools, but also eliminate that bias through the process as well.
A question back to you. Thank you, Grant. To start your journey, how did you start your journey at Westpac in terms of, getting more funds to look at bias and getting investment for technology? What is it that you did? Could you share that with the audience?
Yeah, sure. And I keep coming back to it. It's making sure you've got the data. And for me, it started with a hunch, which is, there was a gut feel that there was things that weren't, that weren't right, that we were seeing, and questioning why we were seeing things, why were we seeing more females, or why we were seeing a certain age group, and some of it can be tied back to there are more males studying technology and there are more, but why is that? And I'm an inquisitive person by nature, so have to keep asking those questions. Or why were we seeing certain results, be it in certain tools that we were using? I knew that the only way I was going to get, I guess, be it listened to or heard, was we were always going to be asked for the data. Prove it. Prove that there's a bias, or prove that there's a an issue with the process. And so being able, and it was a very manual process, don't get me wrong, and we really need to turn around and go, actually, what are the data points telling me along the way? And then being able to tell that story which when you've got the data is hard for people not to acknowledge and go, okay, I believe that there's an issue here. We need to act on it.
Fantastic. So if there's any more questions, if you could put them in the Q&A, I'd be very grateful. I've got a question to Eric, and being a business guy, and what are the business benefits, Eric, that you've seen? Quite apart, I understand the equity and fairness, and it's really, really important to me. But over and above that, what tends to flow to an organisation as a result of reducing bias? Well, if you were saying to a CEO, I'd like you to do this, what would you say?
Well, what I would do is I would cite research from McKinsey and Company, because they did a lot of research a few years ago on this exact topic, and they found that organizations who have greater levels of diversity in their executive ranks tend to perform substantially better across the board. And so they did that study, and others have confirmed those sorts of findings. So generally speaking, diverse organizations perform better. And, that's obviously something that CEOs are going to care about. And I think, though, beyond that, it's not even just as simple as saying diversity is important for performance. It's also the culture. The culture needs to support diverse views too, and not, push people who are different out and away. And I run a team called Innovations. I run the innovation team inside Modern Hire, and I look for people who think differently, who are challenging sometimes to me. So I like diversity of thought because it helps us be more innovative. And I think that's what companies experience on a grander scale, is different views, different perspectives, different backgrounds leads to better solutions overall.
Fantastic. Grant, what about yourself? Well, looks like we're wrapping up here. So I'd really like to thank the panelists for answering all of the questions and participating today. For the attendees, thank you so much, one, for attending, and two, for asking your questions. I hope it's been informative. I've certainly learned a lot from it, and I wish you all a great rest of day. Thank you, everyone. All the best.